They have been able to manage one of the biggest problems in South America.
E-commerce, digital payments, credit, logistics, advertising.
One of the most powerful company in Latin America.
Very, very cleverly.
If you invested 10,000 18 years ago, you would have almost 1 million by now. Still growing at more than 40% a year.
The S&P 500 the last 5 years is up sort of 94%, but Mercado Libre is over 200%.
I personally think that the company is undervalued. If you don't take the risk, you miss the opportunity. But when you look deep down in the research, what you find is...
Welcome to the latest episode of the Intelligent Wealth podcast. And with my usual top guests and contributors, Awet Gurmay, who is the head of research for our company, Minerva Money Management, and my fellow director, Carl Roberts. I'm Tony Byrne. The Intelligent Wealth podcast is for serious investors who want some help in their research into great businesses in the style of investment of ours, which is quality investing. Obviously, any views we give today are not advice. Do not rely on them. It's purely our opinions. And in our experience, it's best to do your own research. Don't follow recommendations, even of the top investors in the world. It inevitably will go wrong because you're a different person to that share expert, shall we say. Mm-hmm. So today's subject is a company not many people have heard of, but if you're in the investment world, you'll be very familiar with a company called Mercado Libre. Now, you're probably listening thinking, who the heck are they? And why is he suddenly speaking Spanish? Well, it's not actually me speaking Spanish. The company Mercado Libre is a South American country. Mercado Libre meaning literally free market in Spanish, because of course Spanish is the language of Argentina and most of South America, where this company is based. Now, Mercado Libre, I would say, is like the Amazon of Latin America. And also you could describe it as Amazon and PayPal combined. So it's quite a brilliant company. And the more we go into this podcast, the more you'll realize this is an outstanding business. In many ways, it's got parallels with a company like Alibaba that dominates third world transactions, retail transactions, online e-commerce, like Amazon does in the Western world, shall we say. So the different continents seem to have different players that seem to dominate in this area. And this is the latest one of them, Mercado Libre. We really like this company because it ticks a lot of boxes that we're looking for in a quality investing company. The thing that makes it so extraordinary, this very successful business, is that they have been able to manage one of the biggest problems in South America, and that's the currency. Because currencies in South America, like much of the world, particularly the lesser developed countries, shall we say, tend to suffer from weaknesses. They tend to suffer from devaluation against the dollar, for example. And what is quite incredible about this business, they've managed to control the currency risk very, very cleverly by having very smart processes to preserve their capital. And they're also succeeding in a less rich part of the world. They've got a lot of disadvantages, I'd say. But as we continue this discussion, we will unveil just how brilliant this business is. Without any further ado, let's go on to our head of research, Awet Gurmay, because he seems to know a lot more about this business than Carl and I do, as he should, of course. So what have you got to say, Awet, about Mercado Libre?
Mercado Libre is one of this extraordinary story growth in Latin America. I think the company is founded by Marcos, when he was a student at Stanford University, from his garage, and he developed it to become one of the most powerful company in Latin America. It's like eBay and PayPal and Amazon combined, and Shopify as well. You can include, some people say Shopify, because they do pretty much everything that you need to run your store and to shop as well. So it is just it's one of the great story, as I said. Since IPO, if you invested in the company, you would have compounded 29% annual compounded growth rate, and the total return would be 9,129% since IPO.
Over what period, Awet, is this?
That's 18 years period.
Okay.
So, for example, if you invested 10,000, 18 years ago, you would have almost 1 million by now.
Wow.
Yeah.
Why didn't you tell me at the time?
Yeah, well, it was a long time ago. But the good thing is that it's a big company, 129 billion market cap, but it's still growing like a startup company, more than 40% a year, and continues to grow. That's why it's one of our largest
Mm.
position in the fund.
Yeah, Marcus Galperin is the name. We were debating this earlier, the three of us, and although we know that's the named individual who still owns 7.5% of the company, the founder of
Mhm.
the company,
Yeah.
we don't know much about him. Is there anything interesting you can tell us about him, Awet?
He's very interesting character. He's still owned. I mean, he's one of the wealthiest person in Argentina. But the good things about him, he has a core values the company follow, which is pretty much like Jeff Bezos. He thinks about hard work, meritocracy, which is Ray Dalio who talks about it. I mean, everyone's opinion is respected, and they think long term, and they think about innovation and so on and so on. I think that's the thing about the company mission is pretty much to democratize e-commerce and payment for underbanked region in the Latin America. As we know, the developed world is pretty much banks are here. Everyone has access to the financial system. Where in countries like Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico and other countries, because they are span across 18 countries, there's a lot of people they don't have access, and the penetration for e-commerce and payment is still very very early. That's why they're still growing around more than 40% a year.
So, how are they able to overcome this issue with the underbanked? How are they able to trade with Mercado Libre, these
Yeah, they have
individuals?
Yeah, they have a great system in place because the key things operating in Latin America is understanding the culture. And Mercado Libre, they have deep expertise in the region. And that's why companies like Amazon, they cannot go to places like Argentina and just suddenly they can disrupt the market because it's quite challenging. It's still they use cash is mostly used there. So Mercado Libre, they understand the culture, they understand the shortfall of the countries. So they have catered all the payment system around to help people to to have access to the financial world.
This is what I'm asking you, Howard. How are they, if they're underbanked, they mainly pay in cash, how are they able to trade with Mercado Libre?
No, they give
How do
them
they do it?
access to banking. They give them access to the financial system. They give them access to loans as well if they need to borrow. It's pretty much they give them the credit card access, and they give them a payment system as well if they want to operate their businesses and so on.
Okay, so they provide it for
So
them,
they
basically,
provide it
like
for them. It's like,
PayPal.
yeah, exactly.
Okay, I get it. Okay. So what's your observations, Carl, of this brilliant company? What are your views about it? Any interesting insights?
Yeah, I think it's interesting being based in the UK, and probably most of our listeners are UK based, some maybe some in the US as well. It's easy to forget that there's other countries out there and not everyone uses Amazon. So we just think that Amazon dominate kind of retail in the UK and US, but actually they don't, many other areas of the world. And this is where someone like Mercado Libre's come in and it's basically taking their market. So look, how it said, it's pretty much impossible now for Amazon to go into Latin America and do what it does in the UK there because Mercado Libre now have that market. You could say they've gone a step further than Amazon with, I think, is it they call their payment system, is it Mercado Pago? Probably pronounced
Yes,
that
yes,
wrong. But that's one of their biggest growth drivers now. I think growing over 40% a year.
yes.
Their fintech element. They've gone heavy on the fintech side of things to allow people to kind of trade and start to use this company, whereas someone like Amazon probably wouldn't have been able to come in and do that. Plus, they've got the network of delivery warehouses, all of that now, and it's an interesting market, isn't it? Because Latin America is a quite a strongly growing market now. Whereas obviously the likes of developed countries, UK, US, we're developed for a reason. We haven't got that kind of GDP growth rate that the Latin American countries have. So whilst they're volatile and currencies, you could say unstable, they've got far more potential for growth. Particularly, look at a country like Argentina, which is really turning around its economy now. That country could
Yes,
really go in
yes,
places, and that's then
true.
got a massive consumer market there for them. But and it's kind of reflected in share prices as well. I mean, if you look at And if we compare that to, say, the S&P 500, but also Amazon over the last 5 years, the S&P 500 the last 5 years is up sort of 94%, but Mercado Libre is over 200% return over 5 years. And compare that to Amazon, well, Amazon's just 68% over the last 5 years total return compared to Mercado Libre, which is 200%. So you can see that that's in a growing market compared to the likes of Amazon. So I think it's interesting place to be if you're someone that likes going into kind of the emerging markets rather than developed world.
Yes, I think one of the fears or worries I would say about this company is much like Warren Buffett resigning as CEO of Berkshire Hathaway recently. The founder owner, Marcus Galperin, he's actually stepping down as CEO at the end of this year, and he's handing over the reins to the person called Ariel. Funny name it is. Zarfzetien, I think. It's very difficult to pronounce. He's going to become executive chairman of the board. This is Marcus Galperin. And his successor, let's call him Ariel, he's the company's current head of commerce. So from 1st of January, he'll be the new CEO. It's always a difficult time when you transition from one CEO to the other, especially if it's a founder owner. We have had cases where it has succeeded very well. Microsoft have managed it from Bill Gates, and Apple managed it, and Tim Cook took over from Steve Jobs. So it can be done, but that's definitely one concern, I would say, for the future. What do you think, Awe? Any other possible disadvantages in the future?
Yeah, I think the first thing we need to think of is Marcus is still young. I mean, he's not. I mean, he even though there's a transition period now, he will be on the board, oversee the company to transition.
Yes.
It will give him time and advice and the mentoring, the coaching that needs until the company transition
Yeah.
over time. So I do not see a risk here because he still will be involved and he still have
Yes.
his skin in the game in the business. And he wants the business to succeed and is growing. And the person who's taken over, he's been in the company for a long time as well. So he does have the expertise. So I do not see the risk here for the company. They will navigate it.
And does Ariel have skin in the game as well? And if so, roughly how much? Do you know?
Ariel doesn't have much skin in the game based on what I have looked at. He's still small. I mean, he is pretty much the biggest holder, Marcus, but Ariel holding is not significant.
I suppose another possible red flag coming up, which affects all companies in the world apart from the US, is tariffs, of course. Mexico is another country that's quite successful in many ways. They've got a big trade surplus with America, for example. That's one of the three main markets for Mercado Libre. But Trump is imposing tariffs on virtually every country in the world, including Mexico. So I suppose that could be a threat as well, couldn't it?
Yeah, but in terms of tariff, what we've seen that it's more against China than Mexico. So the
True.
highest tariff has been toward China because what we're heading to is like a trade war, which is China is a rising empire where the US is pretty much on the decline because of the debt and so on. So we see that transition and more likely to be friendly toward Mexico and Latin American countries. So this reshoring will benefit companies like countries like Mexico. So
Yes.
I personally think for the U.S. interest in the long term, Mexico is to be the best ally of the U.S. And I think even one time I was looking up Ford, when they employ people in Mexico, they pay quite a low wage. I mean, there is a good advantage for the U.S. to move their manufacturing next door in comparison to the U.S., where because they are friendly toward each other. Where in China is completely different because they are, there's a technology war, there's a capital war. There's so many things going on against China. So I personally think there's an advantage for Mexico to benefit from this ongoing trade war.
Yeah. Any other observations, particularly, Carl, that you can think of?
Yeah, I think if we're looking at kind of the positives and its kind of competitive advantages, it's got that kind of, we've spoken about before, the fintech side, so that integrated kind of ecosystem, combining sort of the e-commerce, digital payments, credit, logistics, advertising. So it's got its very well managed, well-known brand platform. It's got that dominant position in Latin America. So you could almost argue there's a bit of a moat around it in terms of its dominance in that region and there's kind of network around it.
Mm-hmm.
We've spoken about previously, it's addressing that unbanked population by offering it's even got its own coin, I believe it's working on as well. And it's got that logistics network as well. So again, it's got the infrastructure to do all the delivery, to move the products and things around. So a lot of competitive advantage. Very hard for a company to come in and try and disrupt Mercado Libre in that region now. But on the downside, you probably talk about valuation. I think the valuation is reflective of its growth over the last few years. So compared to someone like Amazon, I think the price to earnings is over 60 for Mercado Libre, whereas I think it's down to around about 30 for Amazon. You are potentially paying a lot, or you're paying for a lot of expected growth to come. So that is a bit of a risk. It's always volatile in Latin America. So you've mentioned some of the risks, the currency risks. You've got some of the governments are not always that robust. There's still kind of corruption in some of those countries. There is always a risk kind of in that region as well. So ultimately, I think kind of the valuation you'd have to be comfortable with. And also, it's just going into that area is going to be more volatile. If you look at the share price again and the charts and things, you can see just how volatile it is compared to more developed stocks on the S&P 500.
On the other hand, if you were to value it on the price to free cash flow, it's quite reasonable, 20 times. And I would argue that's something that's more reliable than the PE ratio, because it can't be manipulated unlike the PE ratio. I mean, in some respects, you could, sorry to contradict you, Carl, but in some respects, you could argue it's undervalued. If you look at, say, the discounted cash flow value, and its potential great growth rate, which has been pretty high in recent years. What's interesting about them, although they've got 8 billion of debt, they've got slightly more than that in cash. So basically, net debt there's no net debt. And I think that's a pretty good sign as well.
Yeah, I mean,
go on, Howard.
Yeah, I mean, the company is pretty much like, depend how you look at it. And I try to do the discounted cash flow metrics, and I can see the market is implying only 8% growth rate, where the company has been growing more than its free cash flow more than 40%. So based on what the market is implying, I personally think the company is undervalued, and it will be
Interesting.
because I think investors, I think as an investors, we always see risk, but at the same time, if you don't take the risk, you miss the opportunity. There's always risk is going to exist, but there will be an opportunity under risk. Especially, I personally, I think sometimes opportunities are found in the most riskiest things that you think of, because people would just discredited it for being risky. And that's why I think when crisis happen, we see opportunities, and there's always opportunity happen when there's a crisis.
Right. What's good is that they're spending a lot of money on research and development. That's always a good sign. It's up from $590 million to over $1 billion and growing at 13.4% year on year. So that's a pretty good sign, I always feel. Spending a lot of money on tech, AI, and data analytics, always a good sign. And of course, when you think about it, we all think AI is the biggest growth market. But in fact, I read a survey the other day that showed that the biggest growth potential isn't in AI, it's in e-commerce. And we can see this all the time, all around us, can't we? I mean, hardly a day goes by there isn't an Amazon parcel delivered either to my office or to my home. I mean, it's just amazing. And this really does seem to be the big growth area. Of course, it will combine with AI, no doubt.
If you remember as well, there was research done that the 4% by the research that they've done in the last 96 years, only 4% companies managed to outperform the market, to do really generate wealth for investors. But when you look deep down in the research, what you find is companies who are actually done the best are the one who necessity, like Amazon. We rely on them, as you mentioned, Tony. We rely on them daily on a daily basis. So Mercado Libre fits that remit as well. They are pretty much reliant. We rely on this sort of like shopping online every day, and that's why it's growing. It's expected to grow into trillions in the long run.
Yes, very interesting. I wonder why it is that we've not really heard. Well, we've heard of Mercado Libre. We've been invested in Mercado Libre for at least a couple of years, but wonder why the wider public isn't more aware of a company like that. I mean, we're all aware of companies like Alibaba that dominate in the third world for e-commerce. But really, Mercado Libre, when we discovered it just a few years ago, wasn't really very high profile. It's strange how these companies can just pass you by without really making the headlines. So the headlines are all about AI all the time, aren't they? And the Magnificent Seven. We're very biased towards the West, aren't we? But there are some great companies out there that are not very well known. I wonder why that is.
I think if you read, I think there was a book, The Outsider. I think there are few type of leaders, but let's talk about two. There are one like Elon Musk, right? Which is, they are celebrity sort of leaders or
Yes.
managers. And there are like Marcos, which is quite, think long term. They are just introvert, but they are thinking long term. So they are not on the news. They shy away from the news. So, and I think the reason we haven't heard about this company is because the CEOs, they just don't need to go to the media to prove themselves. They are just busy working and improving and generating money for shareholders.
I think we're
Yeah,
just
like
not their
Mark.
market either, are we?
Yes.
We're bombarded with Amazon all day. We would just have no reason to, member of the public would have no reason to know they existed, Mercado Libre, because we're just not their market at the moment. I think the difference between them and Alibaba, I think Alibaba have tried to make some crossover, haven't they, into Europe and the US with some of their kind of products and services. But I think Mercado Libre have just stuck to Latin America for now, haven't they?
Yeah, because they're growing more than 40% in the region. I think if they can come to other countries, it wouldn't be possible to manage it. So because if you think about it, 95% of their revenue comes from the three countries, like as we mentioned earlier,
Yes.
Mexico, Argentina, and Brazil. So there are still 15 countries that they need to grow because they only have 5% market share in there. So they are growing in there. So they have enough market to grow into in the region they need to focus on, and they know that region is quite difficult for any company to come and break into, and they just want to understand it and break into and to become dominant, which they are becoming dominant in the
Yeah.
region.
But even though there are 15 other countries, I think they're all quite small, though, aren't they? I think you find Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, population-wise, are probably the vast majority of South American citizens. I believe. I don't have the figures in front of me, but Awet probably does because he's our head of research. So you probably know Awet.
No, you're right. When we talk about Latin America, the first comes into mind is Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico because they
Yes.
have biggest GDP. The remaining are smaller, but that doesn't mean they cannot grow into, because remember, this company they are growing into fintech and e-commerce, which ultimately everyone would have access to.
I think ultimately the biggest challenge these countries always had, which I said in the introduction, has been the currency. It's always struggled against the dollar. But of course, another thing that could completely transform the rest of the world, the lesser developed countries, shall we say, is Bitcoin, of course. Now, I don't want to divert the subject onto Bitcoin particularly, but if Bitcoin became the main method of transactions, I know it isn't yet because it's growing too fast and the value's too volatile. But in the future, if it became a medium of exchange, which I think is certainly possible, and El Salvador, one of these South American countries, has adopted Bitcoin as their main currency now because their own currency was far too weak. So if that became the medium of exchange, suddenly it's going to transform the whole world, and it would give them as much opportunity as the Western world. I don't think you can discount that, although I'm aware that Bitcoin is produced very divided opinions. You're either for it or against it, I find. A bit
Mhm.
like Marmite, anyway.
Right.
What do you guys
Yeah.
think about that? What about you, Carl? What do you think about that concept?
Yeah, I think. Yeah, I'm not sure whether Bitcoin will ever become like a currency. I just see it more as sort of digital gold. I think it could certainly be a reserve currency and back some sort of fiat system. But yeah, whether that kind of helps. I mean, but the interesting about Mercado Libre, they're kind of almost going down their own kind of digital currency route, aren't they, with
Yes.
their coin and their kind of fintech systems and things. I think what they've done
Yes.
with bringing banking, well, it's clever, really, isn't it? The fact that we want to run a business, but there's loads of, and we want to make it futuristic and online and go down that route. But the problem is our customers still use cash. So what can we do? So they've built a payment system. They've allowed people to take loans to buy their products and things. So that's it's fascinating how they've done it there, really.
Yeah.
Yeah, and of course, in the future, it might not be Bitcoin for transaction. It might be a stable coin.
Yeah, I
It
think
could work if it's totally backed by fiat currency. Anyway, it's just a thought. I think that's just another factor to build into the mix about how it could help it succeed if there is some form of digital currency that becomes an accepted norm in the future, which I think is possible, quite probable. In fact, I think now we're going for so digital in the world, but only time will tell. Of course, none of us can predict the future.
Yeah, I think it looks like most big companies will have their own currencies because they probably realize at some point Bitcoin is maybe like gold, okay, digital gold, we can call it. But I think we need, when we do payment system, you need a fast transaction, a settlement for the exchange of goods and services. And Bitcoin would not be the preferred method because it's quite expensive, it's slower. But other form of payment would come into, as you said, they will be backed by real asset because the areas, the reason the region is quite volatile. I was talking to one guy, he was doing business in Africa, and he was telling me you make profit when you sell someone because you have to wait for like a month to receive your money. By the time you receive your money, the exchange rate is going against you. Suddenly you are making profit because of the exchange rate, you lost money. So he was saying it was quite difficult to make money, even though financially you can make
Yes.
money in terms of gross profit. But by the time that you receive your money, the exchange rate is against you. So that way you lose a lot of money.
That's a good point. So anyway, this is pure speculation at this stage. I just thought it was another factor to throw into the mix that could back an opinion that this is a company that's got great potential to grow even more if you build that into the mix as well. Because I think it's a miracle what they've managed with the exchange rate problems. So throughout my life, I'm 66 now. All I've ever come across in South America is problems. They've so many times in the past, back in the 70s, had to write off huge debts, huge problems with their economies. This has been going on most of my adult life that I can recall. So but doesn't mean there isn't great potential here to grow, and I think it probably will. This is quite a remarkable company and quite a remarkable founder owner, Marcus Galperin. I remember his surname now at last.
Yeah, I think that's probably why there's a lot of pessimism around the share price because people
Yes,
have historically have this negative view on Latin America, which is there's always uncertainties, and
yes,
that's factored in the share price. But when we look at the e-commerce market in Latin America, is expected to grow by 19%, which is
mm,
compounded annual growth rate is expected to be close to $1 trillion by 2028. So that's a big market they can grow to overall. And e-commerce penetration is still early in Latin America, as we mentioned early, which is around 11%, still earlier stage. So there's a big growth rate there for e-commerce, and fintech as well is expected to triple in the next few years because remember, Latin America, most people are underbanked, so they will have to have access to bank. When they have access to bank, they will transact and they will use Mercado Libre fintech side more and more. So there's a lot of tailwind going for this company, and the company is heavily reinvesting on logistic, fintech, and platform innovation and employing AI and so on. So in the long term, think about it. Amazon, they have the infrastructure in place. So even Shopify, they tried to compete with Amazon. They realized it was very painful, and they ended up, pulling out from the e-com because Amazon can take a losses, and they put in the money now for the future. So they're building the infrastructure. Again, Mercado Libre, they are doing the same in Latin America. They building the infrastructure, but the infrastructure is expensive to build that first because they require upfront cost. So
yes,
they are getting ready for the future.
yeah,
I
that's
think I
good.
think it's also worth saying there's a ton of retail US and UK and Europe retail money now going into shares like Mercado Libre, because if you're interested in Latin America and you're going to emerging market funds or ETFs,
Yeah.
this is now going to be one of the biggest holdings in those ETFs, and
Good
it'll only
point.
get bigger. So the bigger that gets, and the more comfortable people are investing in kind of Latin America or emerging market funds, again, just more retail cash is going to come in to go for that share price.
It's a really good point because sentiment has turned against the US this year because of the tariff war. And there's an argument that emerging markets are going to re-emerge. That they go through spells of great outperformance. So I think it's a really good point you've made there, Carl. I think we've covered most of what we wanted to cover today. But before we finish this show, are there any last comments you'd like to make, guys, that you've been burning questions or comments you'd like to make before we close today?
I think I would just say if you're someone that is comfortable with a bit of risk, a bit of volatility, should we say, is the correct word, and you like the emerging markets region, or particularly Latin America, I say this is essentially the company to look at, isn't it? Above all others, it's got over that kind of issues with any kind of corruption or anything dodgy going on. This is now a big company, rooted into the kind of those three countries that we're talking about, the market, big market cap, and is still growing like a startup, like how it said. So I think if you're interested in that region, this is the company to look at.
Sure. And you, Howard, any closing comments?
I mean, this company would give you exposure to 18 countries in Latin America. It's pretty much like a fund. They have diversified, and e-commerce is growing. So if you like to have some exposure to the growing and emerging market, I think Mercado Libre is fairly priced and still run by great people. They have skin in the game, and they are good at allocating capital, and they will succeed in the long run. So if you want to get some exposure to Latin America, that would be a company that to have a look into.
Great. Well, I concur with you, gentlemen. We're coming towards the end of the show, as I just mentioned. If you need any more materials, just look in our show notes. Please, remember to recommend us to your friends, and on Apple Podcasts, give us a positive review. It would be really appreciated. We need more followers, and we like to add value. We hope you enjoyed today's show. Thank you for attending. The next one, we're going to cover a more established, well-known company, Berkshire Hathaway. So this will be a very interesting show, I promise you. Thanks for your attendance today, and thanks for your expertise as usual, guys. Well done. Have a great day.
Thank you for joining us today. Please help us spread the word by sharing this podcast with your family and friends. And don't forget to subscribe.